The communities hit hardest by the recent wildfires are full of history and unique stories.
Creator of LA in a Minute, Evan Levitt, put together many of those stories. He's joining us today.
Evan, thanks for being here. I mean, those of us who are familiar with your work on Instagram, you know, X, Twitter, you name it, Facebook, I think they're just such great historical pieces. You teach people who, whether, you know, I've only been here 23 years, these two were born here, but there's a lot of stories people just don't know. But I love how you bring history to life. How have these fires impacted you on a personal level?
Man, I mean, who doesn't know somebody whose house burned down, unfortunately? You know, my wife's an interior designer. She has clients in Palisades. We both have friends in Altadena. And just seeing the devastation and the scramble to resume some sort of normalcy or life without really having anything to go back to is honestly a sad and terrible situation. These people have kids, they have pets, and you know, we're trying to help out, we're trying to volunteer, donate. But I got to tell you, you know, even weeks after, you know, the fires broke out, it still feels strange. It still feels weird. I don't feel like Los Angeles is back to normal even on a daily basis. And that's something that, you know, every day I'm kind of wrestling with. Even as I'm generating content, you know, I try to celebrate the city of Los Angeles, the history and the culture, but you know, you don't want to be too rah-rah at this point when so many people are suffering. I mean, it's more than 100,000 people affected, so it's really, really devastating. And to me, along with the 1994 earthquake, this is one of the two biggest events, most traumatic events in my lifetime in Los Angeles.
Very well said. And you would know so much more than most, that's for sure. All right, let's talk about the fires. Let's start with the Eaton Fire in Altadena. You did a piece on the rich culture and history of Altadena, and let's take a look at one of those.
Development was initially slow due to an economic downturn in the late 1880s, but with the construction of Thaddeus Lowe's Mountain Railway connecting Los Angeles to Altadena and the mountains beyond, Altadena became a bona fide tourist destination. The newly sprouted community immediately began to attract millionaires from the East, including newspaper moguls William Scripps and William Kellogg, and author Zane Grey, who built mansions and formed what became Millionaires Row on Mariposa near Santa Rosa Avenue. From there, Altadena was the beneficiary of the Great Migration, where many African Americans moved west to escape the Jim Crow South. Altadena's open spaces and relative affordability compared to neighboring Pasadena made it an attractive destination. And by the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, a vibrant black community had taken root, overcoming redlining and the restricting housing covenants to create a rich cultural and social network. Altadena developed a reputation as a haven for black professionals, educators, and creatives. Notable figures such as Willa Beatrice Brown, the first black woman in the United States to receive a commercial pilot's license, and artist Charles White called Altadena home, cementing its status as a mecca in Los Angeles for African Americans.
I love this. I love that you brought attention to it, and you know, I have an aunt that lives in Altadena, and the fact that, and that's one of the things that, you know, everyone who's suffered from the fires is suffering. There is no black and white. It's suffering is suffering.
Right.
However, Altadena has a separate history from the Palisades that is unique to the African American culture, and many of those homes may be paid off without, you know, adequate insurance. Like, there may be insurance, but it's not full replacement insurance because it's been in the family for generations.
Correct.
So I think the recovery for both areas are going to be different. Can you kind of speak to that?
Oh man, so as you said, you know, look, Palisades has definitely a rich history, but Altadena's is just so unique in the sense of Los Angeles because it was one of the first areas in LA that was not redlined or restricted for housing. And because after the Great Migration, you know, the African American families came over and were able to buy property. And as you said, they're handed down through generations. So it's not the wealth necessarily, it's a home and it's a property, and you know, with the insurance situation, that's difficult to spearhead the rebuild and everything. So it takes a little bit more of a community effort, and by community I mean the entirety of Los Angeles. And I think one connection with Altadena that shows how intertwined we are in this huge geographic region of LA is Randy Nickerson, who was the grandson of William Nickerson, who was the founder of Nickerson Gardens, the largest housing project in Los Angeles, which happens to be in Watts, lived in Altadena, and he perished during the fires. But there was an outpouring of support in Nickerson Gardens and in Watts, and they had to drive donations, and a celebration of life that goes to Altadena. And it kind of just shows how much we do need and how much everybody in this community of Los Angeles is really stepping up to help, the legacy families, Altadena and otherwise.
Let's continue to talk about Altadena. It's also home to one of the most significantly historical properties Southern California has. I think a lot of people aren't even aware of that. That's
Agreed.
the beauty of these things. I mean, there's so much rich history, and this is a jewel right here.
So I think one thing that's really important, because the indigenous people are the true natives to Los Angeles. In a land of transplants, even to this day, 51% of people in Los Angeles were born outside of Los Angeles. We've always been the land of transplants, but the true native people, there are multiple tribes, the Gabrielino, the Quiche, and the Tongva, and Altadena is the location of the first land reclaimed by any of LA's indigenous tribes. In 2022, a woman named Sharon Alexander gave a 1 acre parcel of land, which was on one of the sites of the indigenous village in Altadena, back to the Tongva, and now that's owned by the Tongva Conservancy, and they use it for rituals, for housing, and to have their space that they own, which is the first land owned by indigenous people in Los Angeles in more than 200 years.
And the Tongva have a great history here in Southern California. I know that they were in parts of North Orange County that was part of the migration that came, I guess you would say a lot of them were pushed out, but their heritage still remains, and that's what needs to be preserved, I would think.
Absolutely. And, it's one of the stories of Altadena has always been persevering through adversity, and that's just so representative of that, whether it was the African Americans, the Great Migration, the Tongva, and reclaiming the land. And also it's worth noting that in Altadena, there's a grave site of Owen Brown, who was the last surviving member of the last surviving participant of the slave revolt at Harper's Ferry in Virginia in 1859. So Altadena has all kinds of really historic and significant history. And, as a community, it's a proud and wonderful place that is going to build back and be strong.
Absolutely. Let's also, of course, talk about the Pacific Palisades. Hit especially hard. One of the areas destroyed by the fires, many people may not know about. I wasn't familiar with it. It's called the Palisades Bowl Mobile Estates. It actually opened up in 1955. Let's look at a clip of that.
The community then, as in now, had breathtaking vistas and unparalleled access to the LA beaches and coastline. The spots at the Trailer Bowl rented out quickly, filled mostly by working class retirees and transplants. But the Trailer Bowl was not without danger, however, as a 1958 landslide endangered the park and forced an evacuation, isolating 154 families. The incident led to an entire rerouting of what was then named Pacific Coast Highway, but soon residents returned to the area. As neighboring Malibu and Pacific Palisades developed into wealthy enclaves, the trailer park remained one of the last affordable residences in the area and highly desirable. Again, views and coastal access were nearly unparalleled as residents described living at the Trailer Bowl heaven on earth. In the ensuing decades, many of the trailers were handed down through generations in their families. And even as new residents moved in, they were always welcomed into the tight-knit community.
I love that you did this.
Yeah.
Because if you've ever driven PCH,
Right.
you can see it. You were like, golly, wonder how long those have been there. And now we know, 1955, right?
Right.
And to lose a piece of LA cultural history like that, it just, I always thought those people are so lucky. They have like some of those, expensive real estate in town right there, and it was rent controlled, and it was all these things, and so you could, correct me if I'm wrong, you could see it right there on PCH.
It's right there on PCH, and what's funny is it was one of the first mobile home parks in all the United States, and it's actually founded in 1939.
Okay.
It opened in its current state in 1955, but when
okay.
it opened in 1939, it wasn't really, mobile home parks weren't a thing, so
Right.
it wasn't celebrated as such, and most people would park their trailer there, but it became like the Palisades Bowl Mobile Estates in 1955. But it's interesting, like you say, because again, let's be honest, we think of Palisades and surrounding communities as wealthier enclaves, but you could buy a home in Palisades Bowl Mobile Estates for $500,000, which again is a significant amount of money, but by LA terms, anywhere in LA.
On the beach.
Yeah,
Right.
on the beach with some of the best vistas and views. So, I mean, it really was a place for working class folks. There are people in the restaurant industry, a lot of retirees, teachers. I mean, this was working class folks that were able to live right on the beach with these views and enjoy Palisades, and that really is a devastating part of.
And I'm thinking, I think that's the sad part, is because developers are going to come in and want to develop these things, and I think that's such a part of the rich history, and which makes it unique. And hopefully we don't lose some of those things, but I know that's a concern because that is worth a lot of money to developers.
Oh man, right there on the beach.
Yeah.
I can't speak to that, but
when I watch this story, and I don't know if you know this, is it owned? Do the people who live there, did they own their slots, or did they lease that? Like, they own their mobile home, right? But did they own the property it was on?
Yeah.
Wow, I don't want to give an answer that I'm not
it's
certain
okay.
about.
I'm sorry to put you on the spot.
I know that you buy the home and you pay a rent, but it's my understanding that rent is almost like an HOA.
Yeah.
Don't quote. I mean, I guess I'm quoting, but I'm not 100% certain. But I know there's a rent, but it's like a homeowners association fee.
Tell us about the other interesting fact, though, that you learned about Palisades. There was one specific one that was
this
really
kind of blew my mind because I'd never heard about this, and that's sort of where LA in a Minute comes from, is because there's so much history and culture that we never celebrate. But Palisades was one of the first American refuge areas for people fleeing the Holocaust and fleeing Nazi Germany. I mean, all these influential, Austrian, German, European people came to Palisades, such as the writer Thomas Mann, composers, playwrights, and Palisades was a community that embraced all these people, and they were, essentially makeshift think tanks where people could reunite with their Austrian, German brethren. And Palisades just has a rich history of Holocaust survivors. And it's very interesting because it was founded as a Methodist city in 1922, but within the first 20 years after, it became a Jewish stronghold, and just from European refugees fleeing the Holocaust, which is pretty significant.
Before we let you go, as a historian of LA, you already said this earlier about how next to the 1994 Northridge earthquake, this is like the biggest thing LA's been through. Yeah. And even then, there was a greater loss of life then, but there wasn't the monetary. This is the worst disaster in LA history. So for you, looking present and forward, what would you like to see culturally come out of this situation?
Honestly, and you bring up a point too, and I was in the valley. I lived in Northridge during the earthquake. The devastation in the valley, and yes, down to Orange County, there was damage. But this is different in the sense that you have two completely different sides of the city, 25 miles apart. Palisades on the west, Altadena in the northeast. Like, it really, A, affects everybody, but B, you think about that rebuild. And for me, I don't want to see these McMansions or these tract-style homes. And I know there are groups, specifically in Altadena as well, these conservancies and heritage groups that have architects and designers that are willing to donate their services to try to help rebuild and at least restore some of these historical buildings, because they really were important to the communities. And you have to keep that rich legacy alive as much as you can. And I would love to see that happen in both areas and any areas affected by the fires.
I hope you're right, because it would be a dangerous shift in many ways to have big corporations come in and lose a lot of that culture, and then also price a lot of people out that, unfortunately.
Whose families have been there for generations.
Exactly.
That's the biggest point. That's probably the most important part, is being able to get the residents that grew up in these communities.
Made that community.
And then made it, not just enjoyed it, but they're the reason why it has that culture, that history, and the community. I mean, look, we were going to live in Altadena in 2019. We put a bid on a home in Altadena, and we were going to live there because you go there and it's unlike anywhere in Los Angeles, where you have Eaton Canyon, you have the hikes, and you have the Mount Lowe Railway, which was the railway in the clouds, which is crazy. But all that history, community, great restaurants, great places to hang out. So if there's any way to recreate that, I mean, it's going to be a long, long process. But I know people are focused on that, and there are great companies, organizations, and people that do understand the richness of that legacy and are going to at least try to rebuild that.
Thank you, Evan.
Yeah.
All
hey,
right.
you know what? We need to have Evan back to do.
I love this guy. You're talking to the right guy.
I mean, instead of a minute, I mean, these cities, you can go on for a half hour. Not that we want to do that, but
if
I mean,
you want to just see him in a minute, he has a podcast, In a Minute with Evan. He's all over social media. It's available where you get your podcasts, and be sure to follow LA in a Minute on all social platforms. Thank you, Evan. We'll be right back.
Thank you guys very much.